Hello everyone, Insightful Nomad here. Today we're going to be looking at a clip of one of the more famous anti-Israel or Israel-bashing academics or activists, if you'll call it that, Norman Finkelstein, a man who I've been following for a very long time. And he is a very clever and a very savvy debater. But in this particular case, he really struggled to answer a very basic question that was put to him. And I don't think it ended very well for him. So let's take a look and see what happened.
This is a difficult question to ask, but I feel that it needs to be said.
Mm-hmm.
The events of October the 7th were vile, awful, and you cannot justify that in any shape or form. Not to say that you are, I'm just saying that we both agree on that. What should Israel have done afterwards? Because we look at what's happened at Gaza, but what Hamas did was an act of war, and it was barbaric. And Israel had to retaliate in some shape or form. So I guess my question to you is, if you were Benjamin Netanyahu, what would you have done?
I am not going to evade questions.
Yeah.
So do not take what I'm about to say as a diversion. And you're absolutely free to press me and press me and press me. But I do have to convey how I see the question.
Of course.
Your question to me has to be preceded by what I would call an antecedent question, which is, what did you expect the people of Gaza to do? What do I mean by that? So,
well, look, let's not get into that for this reason, because in terms of having this discussion, let's accept when we had Bassem on, for example, this was the nature of the debate we had, right? He was saying, well, what do you expect the Palestinians to do? And I said, let's accept that while they're uprising, as Francis said, you called it, I think, a prison outbreak. Let's accept concentration camp outbreak. Let's say that that's what it is.
By the way, that's something that Norman Finkelstein does a lot. He uses this very insulting, inflammatory language on purpose, like concentration camp, genocide, all these words that are meant to kind of like evoke emotion and hatred. So concentration camp is like the Holocaust. That's not a coincidence that he uses that type of terminology at all when he's talking about these issues.
Nonetheless, the fact is that Israel exists. Israel was attacked in this barbaric way. Let's say that the Palestinians have every cause to try and free themselves in this way. I don't know how killing and raping civilians does that, but let's set that aside.
Good point.
That still leaves the question of what should Israel do in this situation? It still leaves that question on the table. So let's say, without going into the detail, just for time reasons, that we accept everything you say about the suffering of the Palestinian people. Nonetheless, on top of that, what should Israel do in this situation?
I have pondered that question.
Okay.
And I recognize that to say they should have done nothing except to end the illegal and inhuman blockade of Gaza, which...
Debatable. If there's an inhuman blockade of Gaza, if you've seen videos of Gaza from before the war or even during the war, then that's not exactly what Gaza is like, but we'll get into that later.
Goldstone described as elements of a crime against humanity to immure 2 million people, half of whom are children, in what Israel's head of the National Security Council, Giora Eiland, described as, quote, a huge concentration camp. What your British economist, before October 7th, he described as Gaza as a human rubbish heap.
By the way, I have to say, this strategy is something that Norman Finkelstein has employed throughout his entire career in debates and in discussions, is that he'll he has a very good memory. So he'll say, such and such official said, quote, something. This human rights report said, quote, something. And this lends a lot of authority to what he's saying. But it should be noted, the fact that some official said in a conversation in a certain context that Gaza is a concentration camp doesn't mean that it's true. A, there's another 20,000 officials who didn't say the same thing. B, that same official who he mentioned, I happen to know who he is because when I was working in the news in Israel, he's interviewed a lot, and I know for a fact that that's not his position, meaning he could have said that in order to exaggerate or in a certain context, I don't know. And C, there are other things besides quotes that people make. You can observe in Gaza that tons of Gazan influencers were leaving Gaza all the time, making videos in Turkey and Dubai. I met a Gazan refugee when I was in Cairo. You had thousands of them going into Israel for treatment, thousands of them going to Jerusalem to Al-Aqsa on Ramadan. And of course, the fact that Hamas is largely responsible for the fact that there is supervision or even a blockade, if you want to call it, on rockets and other materials going into Gaza because they keep using those materials to attack Israel, which of course he doesn't mention. But he'll say, he said this, quote, he said this, quote, he said this, quote. So you as a viewer are like, wow, look how horrible it is. But that doesn't mean at all that that's an accurate reflection of reality. And calling Gaza a concentration camp is a big, big lie, a big, big lie. And you guys should know that.
Secretary General of the
No, let's say we accept all of this, just for the sake of argument.
He's getting tired of it.
I recognize that question.
Okay.
Okay,
So
good.
what's the answer?
Answer.
My answer is, first of all, on one level, it's a little late in the day to be asking that question. But asking it, you can still make the argument that whatever Israel did, whatever was done to Israel, whatever was done to Israel. If you, for example, look at the South Africa application, it begins by saying what happened on October 7th was horrible, awful, terrible, so on and so forth. It said, and I'm quoting it, paraphrasing.
Quoting.
Whatever was done to Israel on October 7th, nothing whatsoever could justify a genocide.
We can talk about that separately, but what should they have done?
I don't think it's so easy.
That's not answering my question. That's the only reason I'm interrupting you. As I think you've observed, we're fair interviews. We've given you lots of time.
How many times already has he asked what has Israel should do? What should Israel do? I think we're already on like the fourth time. And it's also something, again, like I noticed, there's a lot of what Israel shouldn't have done. And of course, you can argue what he's saying, how accurate it is. Obviously, a genocide is a completely ludicrous charge. But they always say Israel shouldn't have done this, Israel shouldn't have done that. What should Israel have done? What should it have done? And he just continues to not answer and to go back to the issue of, well, Gazans were in this terrible situation, so this was coming. It's a bit late to be asking that question, sort of like at this point, Israel had it coming on October 7th, and they're not have any response that they do is unjustified because, according to him, the past is so one-sided that what else can you expect? But again, they ask him the question, what should they have done? What should they have done?
No problem.
So my question is, what you've described about what's happening in Gaza, what you've described about happening in Gaza prior to October 7th, let's, for the sake of argument, let's just say that that's all the case.
I agree with you. I think that's a fair question.
So do I.
I wrestled with that question.
So what should Israel have done?
I would say that I'm not trying to divert. There's two concepts in international law, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum basically means who's the aggressor, who's the defender, okay? That's jus ad bellum. Jus in bello is how you conduct the war. And you have to conduct the war according to what we call IHL, International Humanitarian Law, the laws of war. That's conducting. I would say if Israel's, I'm not going to say which side is right and which side is wrong. That's jus ad bellum. I'm not going to discuss it. Jus in bello, I would say if you're going to carry out a war, even if it's a war of aggression, even if it's a war of aggression, let's say you believe Russia's engaged in a war of aggression against Ukraine, it's still bound by the laws of war. And even if Ukraine is defending itself, it too is bound by the laws of war.
Mm-hmm.
So I will say, I'm going to separate out the question of who's right and who's wrong.
Yes.
And I'll simply focus on then the laws of war.
And what should Israel have done then? Okay, Israel's conducting the war badly. You've made that point. Now, what should Israel do? How exactly should they have conducted the war?
Whether it's right or wrong, it still has to obey the laws of war. But Israel is carrying out what, in my opinion, not in my opinion, what the International Court of Justice described as a plausible genocide.
So just so I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, are you saying that what Israel should have done is retaliated and destroyed the organization that attacked Israel?
No, I'm not saying
You're
that.
not saying that?
No.
So what should they have done?
I said if they choose to engage in
Then they
war,
should follow the rules of war.
then they have to follow the
But
laws
what
of war.
should they?
So
should
what
they
should they
have
have done?
retaliated? Should they have attempted to take out Hamas? Should they be trying to kill the people who
No,
attacked their people?
I would say I cannot accept those judgments, the ones you just rendered. I understand they're not necessarily your judgments, but you're telling me.
Yeah.
Should they have? No, I can't accept those judgments because it's like, for me, I'll just give you the closest analogy I can.
So instead of answering the question,
happened, the first day, it was unclear exactly the magnitude of what had occurred. The numbers were being given where 50 Israelis were killed. It wasn't clear if they were combatants or civilians. And it was only about, you would say, about the third or fourth day, it was clear that a crime of significant magnitude had occurred. Atrocities of a very significant magnitude had occurred. By now, the figure is about 850 civilians were killed.
answer the question.
That's a significant crime by any standard. There's no question in my mind about that. Even if you allow for collateral damage and this and that, no, there's something very substantial that occurred there. And then I had to ask myself exactly the question you asked. You know, what should Israel have done, and how do you allocate, so to speak, more responsibility? Let's leave the legal question aside. More responsibility. And after thinking about it very hard, the answer, what resonated for me, what seemed right for me, was to see it in the terms, for myself as an American, in terms of the slave rebellions. And if you look at, for example, the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 in the United States, if you look at the details, it was very ugly. You know, Nat Turner, he gave the order to his Confederates, kill all whites. That was the order, okay? And they went from house to house, and unlike in Gaza, they did behead babies. They took out an axe, chopped off the head of babies, cracked skulls, killed about 61 whites.
See, the problem with this thing is, again, and he's done this before, is he keeps making this allegory that just doesn't represent what's happening in reality. Gaza is a concentration camp. The Palestinians are like the African slaves, and this is some type of slave revolt. Everything is just a reaction to what Israel's doing. I mean, the reality is describing is very inaccurate and incorrect, but he doesn't at any point make the attempt to maybe consider the possibility that the Palestinians have an ideology concerning the Jews having a state, the Jews being self-determined, not willing to compromise on any portion of the land that could be motivating them to go and commit these attacks. The only possible explanation is a reaction, right? So he keeps, because he has a struggling to kind of explain what they did and the brutality of what they did, and to come up with a reasonable way that Israel can respond, he keeps going back to this, well, look, the Palestinians are like this, and the Palestinians are like that, like the Holocaust, and like the slaves in America, and like everything, avoiding the question and creating these false allegories that just don't represent at all this specific situation.
And once
Still
I felt
hasn't
that
answered the question.
seemed like a fairly reasonable analogy, then the question for me became, how did the abolitionists, those who oppose slavery, how did they react to Nat Turner's rebellion?
Okay, let's just see if he answers the question, because I'm getting tired of this.
If they tried negotiations,
Moving forward.
they gestured to supporting either a two-state settlement, here I'm referring to Hamas, or what they called a hudna, a long-term ceasefire, when in March, beginning March 30th, 2018.
Hamas have never offered a two-state solution. That's complete nonsense. Their charter talks about waging jihad and murdering Jews and having rivers of blood flowing. But it's not just a charter, it's everything that they've said and done. You have to be a real idiot to think that the Palestinians at any point were willing to accept Israel. And a hudna is a long-term truce that is, the purpose of it is to be able to rebuild yourself and wait for your opponent to be weaker down the road so you can attack them later. So the fact that Hamas is offering a hudna because they're weaker than Israel now so that they can destroy them later is not a particularly great compromise.
They tried, not least because of my encouragement, they tried nonviolent civil resistance. And what was the Israeli response? We know exactly. There's a
Okay, we're just going to move forward here because he keeps obfuscating, not answering the question.
And so when all the options of diplomacy, nonviolent civil resistance, when they've been exhausted, what were they supposed to do?
We've already accepted that. For the sake of this argument, I've said repeatedly, let's accept everything you're saying about the plight of the Palestinian people. None of what you're saying, though, is going to solve what's going on.
Yeah, well, to solve it, I would say you have to use the convention. I'm not, by the way, just to clarify, even though in our
so
our conversation before the program began, I said I belong to the Marxist tradition. I see myself there. I'm not a radical on these subjects. If you can hear me through this whole conversation, I was just quoting international law.
I'm not suggesting you're radical.
So I'm asking is,
So yeah, I saved you about 5 or 6 minutes of more of the same thing, but a lot of obfuscation going on there. But basically, he can't answer the question, but he keeps going back to these analogies of the Palestinians are like in the Holocaust, in the concentration camp, the Palestinians are like the slaves in America, and they're uprising against their oppressors. The Palestinians are in a prison, they're breaking out of a prison. All these analogies which are simply not correct. But they also show a fundamental problem, which is the issue of this idea that constantly the only reason they would ever engage in violence and try to kill Jews or destroy the state of Israel is because they're victims of Israel. There could not be any underlying ideology of their own which says very clearly that the Jews cannot be self-determined in their own country, that the Jews don't belong in the land, that Israel shouldn't exist at all, which they say time and time again. Instead, he's claiming that Hamas wants a two-state solution, wants to negotiate with Israel. When did Hamas ever say such a thing? I mean, their charter says wage jihad and kill the Jews. And the Palestinians themselves, he said they exhausted all negotiation options. Well, in 2001, when they negotiated, they had a deal on the table, which Mr. Arafat walked away from, according to U.S. President Bill Clinton, according to U.S. negotiator Dennis Ross, according to the Israeli memoirs, according to Prince Bandar, the Saudi negotiator, all say the same thing. That was Arafat that walked away from a solution that would have given him Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and almost complete control over Al-Aqsa. But he walked away from it because it would mean accepting the existence of the state of Israel. We saw this with the Egyptians also. They negotiated a deal with Israel, yet they continued to claim that it was impossible to negotiate with Israel. The only reason they got that deal was because they defeated Israel in the Grand War of 1973. No, it turns out that they haven't exhausted negotiating with Israel. They prefer and love the idea of waging war against Israel and defeating it much more than looking Israelis in the eye and shaking hands and reaching some kind of negotiated settlement or compromise, which is the ideology that is really motivating them rather than them constantly being a victim and going back to this analogy that the Palestinians are like this and they're like that and like this situation in history and this situation in history. Can't possibly be. They have their own ideas and concepts regarding Israel and how Israel should not exist, and it's perfectly justifiable to go and do what they did on October 7th and attack, massacre people and so forth in the name of that goal. Finkelstein didn't answer the question. He had about 15 minutes to do so. So there you go. And yeah, people say that you have to put his thing on ×2 speed because he talks very slowly, and that drew this video out a little bit. I tried to shorten it by fast forwarding a little bit, but this is what came out. So thank you very much for watching, guys. See you next time. Bye-bye.